Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Flying Lessons for Flight Sim. I'm going to talk about trim today and how you can use trim to make yourself a better flight sim pilot. We're in Desirade, Guadeloupe, and going to take about a 20-minute flight over to the main island. Trim is usually one of two things, or both. It's usually either underutilized, not utilized at all, and poorly understood. What it's for and what to use it for. The trim tab is this part of the trailing edge of the elevator that you can see right here. In the Cessna, at least in the 172, it's only on one elevator, which is I found a little bit interesting actually. In the Piper Cherokee, it goes along the entire trailing edge of the stabilator, which goes from like here all the way over to here. So that's what the trim tab is, and of course, in the C-172 G1000 that we're flying today, you operate that with the buttons on your yoke. Now, what I'm doing right now is putting in full nose up trim. Now what the trim tab does, you can see here, this is nose up trim, which is the trim tab goes down, which deflects the elevator up in the back and deflects the nose up. And when you go in the opposite direction, you'll see it moving slowly, slowly, slowly. And please excuse my voice. I do have a bit of cough going on, so I apologize for that. That is full nose down trim, and that deflects the elevator up and the nose down. Excuse me, this deflects the elevator down and the nose down. So basically, elevator up, elevator down, nose down, and the trim tab deflects in the opposite direction that the elevator deflects when you're using trim. So that's what trim is, or functionally what it is. Now let's talk about how we use it. Trim, and even a lot of it's very often underutilized in real flying. Let's go rotating beacon on. Mixture is rich. There is no carb heat. Master and battery switches are on. There is a fuel pump in this airplane, so we'll turn the fuel pump on. Correct the throttle. Take a look outside. Make sure there's nobody out there to kill or maim. And let's engage the starter. Good start. Magnetos back to both. Throttle to 1,000 RPM. Oil pressure looks good. Avionics master coming on. Lean the mixture for taxi. So trim is generally speaking underutilized and often in the flight sim environment misunderstood. You trim for airspeed, not for vertical speed. And that's kind of the important thing to remember. An airplane will always do whatever it can do to return to its trimmed airspeed. So if you've got the airplane trimmed for 90 knots, the airplane wants to stay at 90 knots. And if it has to pitch the nose up or down in order to do so, it will. And that's kind of the key thing to understand about trim. And regarding airspeed specifically, if you want to become a better pilot, learn to control your airspeed. Airspeed control is such a crucial part, particularly of approaching and landing, and even more so the faster, more powerful airplane that you get that you're flying. So we'll take off here and head over to La Raisette on Guadeloupe, and we'll talk about trim along the way. Tow brakes are engaged. Release the parking brake. I'm going to turn these lights off. I don't know why they're on every time you turn the plane on, but they are. This is Sim Update 14, by the way, which is not relevant to this video, but it happens to be Sim Update 14. So as we are preparing for takeoff here, I'm gonna skip a lot of things that I normally do, like flight control checks and pre-departure briefing, all that stuff. We're gonna simply focus on getting this airplane off the ground, and talking about trim. So on departure, most airplanes will have some sort of a takeoff indication on the there's a trim indicator in the airplane, and you're going to have a takeoff indication somewhere on that. And here, what you can see is this is the trim wheel, this is the indicator, and as you can see, I've been fooling around with it, so it's been it's completely out of whack. So what we're going to do is put it in the takeoff position. Now, unfortunately, in this airplane, VY is 74 knots, which is your best rate of climb speed. And in theory, if you have the trim set at the takeoff setting, you should climb at VY. That's the theory. I know for a fact in this airplane that doesn't work. Let's just try it anyway, and I'll show you guys. If there's no indication on the trim indicator for takeoff, generally speaking, you will have in your pilot's operating handbook or your checklist, there will be an indication of where you should put your trim prior to takeoff. And that's a very, very important thing to pay attention to, because if you're completely out of trim on takeoff, it's going to make your job a lot harder. And if you're in IMC in particular, it could really be a problem. So make sure that your trim is set correctly for takeoff. It's very, very important. So let's turn our nav and strobe lights on. Let's turn our landing light on because we're under 10,000 feet. Mixture is rich. Not going to use any flaps for this takeoff. We are not on VATSIM, which is unusual for me, but I just want to be able to focus on this flight. This is the little Grand Anse the little Desirade Airport. Pretty cool little spot. Great airport to fly into. Really neat approach. Now that I look at the length of the runway, I am going to put in some flaps. Let's get out here on center line. I'll put in 10 degrees of flaps, and we'll do a short field takeoff. So, engage the brakes. Flaps are set. Mixture is rich. There is no carb heat. Fuel pumps on. Takeoff power coming in. Holding the brakes. Takeoff power 2330 is good. Temperatures and pressures in the green. Release the toe brakes rather. And our rotation speed is 50 knots, 55 knots. Airspeed is alive. And boy, am I glad I did put in the flaps and did a short field takeoff. Alright, so right now I am holding the nose for that 74 knot climb. If I let go of the pressure that I have on the yoke right now, the nose is going to pitch right down. You can see that. So the takeoff trim for this airplane is not correct. So what I'm going to do, using the G1000 screen there as a help visually, I'm going to pitch for 74 knots. And by pitch for 74 knots, what I mean is to slow the airplane down, you pull the nose up. So I'm going to pull the nose up until I get 74 knots. I'm going to hold it right there. Now I'm going to start trimming. I'm going to start trimming so that the airplane maintains that 74 knots without me pulling back on the yoke. See those small trim adjustments I'm making? Making little pulls on the yoke just to maintain that 74. Need a little bit more trim. Alright, so that's pretty close. 76, 75. So we are now climbing at about the airspeed that we want. And that's a destination behind this. This is a really cool island. So on takeoff, you're just looking for that VY, that best rate of climb speed, and you'll take whatever vertical speed the airplane will give you, depending on the weather conditions. Depending on the weather conditions, you're gonna get different climb rates. And once you get about 1,000 feet above the level of your departure airport, you can push the nose down and pick up some speed for what we call cruise climb. And I'm going to start a little turn to the left here as well. So I'm just pushing the nose down. You can see that speed picking up, climbing to 3,000. And once that magenta trend line gets to the 90, I want to hold it right there. And then again, I will use my trim to hold that 90 knots that I want to hold. Just you hear those little clicks of nose down trim that I'm putting in. Now I'm letting go of the yoke, and I can see the nose is pitching back up. So a little bit more nose down trim. Little bit more nose down trim. And there we go. Now we're trimmed for 90 knots. So make a gentle left turn here. I forgot to bring my flaps up, which does make me somewhat... No, I didn't actually. I take that back. Yes, I did. Because I can just see my airs. But when you reconfigure the airplane, it's going to give you different performance based on... It's not going to stay... I was trimmed for 90 knots with the first notch of flaps. So once you release that first notch of flaps, it's going to change the trimmed airspeed. So come back to 90 here. And we're coming up on 3,000 feet. And once we get about 50 feet below our desired cruise altitude, we'll start pushing that nose over, pulling the power back, and leveling off. I'll pull the power back to about 2,400. Alright. Those RPMs are going to inch up a little bit because I'm pushing the nose down. So I'm going to pull that back a little bit, trying to stay level. And now, what we're going to do, so in cruise flight, what you have a target RPM setting that you have. Mine is 2,400. And what you want to do is make a gross trim application, which is kind of a big general trim application in the direction that you want to trim. Like I want to trim the nose down, so I just put in a big push on that button to get some nose down trim in. Then I look to see where things are, and then I can fine tune it. But it just so happens that I'm actually right about exactly where I want. It's pitching down a little bit, so I'm going to pull up on the nose. Give it one little shot of nose up trim, and hold it right there. So there we are at 2,400 RPM, 3,000 feet. And this is what we want for cruise. So for cruise, again, you just want to target RPM setting, and you really want to be precise with your RPM setting, because if you get any, for instance, carb ice, which you're not going to get in this plane because it's not a carbureted engine, but if you get carb ice, the first indication of carb ice is a drop in RPM. So you want to make sure that your RPM is precise. You don't want to be at 2,370 or 2,430. You want to be exactly where you desire. Alright, so next thing with trim, let's talk about how you slow an airplane down. So, if I want to slow this airplane down, what I'm going to do is pull some power out. Now I'm going to pull it back to 2100, and I'm going to maintain level flight. And what's going to happen is the airspeed is going to bleed off. Let me come back down here so you can see the trim wheel again. So here we are at 2100 RPM. Got to give it some, pull that nose up some more. And now I want to trim a little bit to maintain that pitch attitude. In a real plane, it's a lot easier to trim. You can kind of hold the button down and feel it where it's going. In the sim, if you hold the button down, it just completely over trims. So you really have to do it click by click, I find. So right here, about 2100 RPM and level flight, we're going to get about 90 knots. Now 90 knots is now our trimmed airspeed. And remember I said before that the airplane wants to maintain the trimmed airspeed. Now I have shown some poor piloting here by letting us drop 300 feet. I wanted to be at 3,000. But now we can demonstrate one of the really interesting things about trim. So we're at 90 knots. I'm now going to go full power. Not going to touch the yoke except to correct left and right drift. And we're going to watch what happens. First of all, the nose pitches up. That airspeed is down to 86. Now the nose pitches down. And that airspeed is going to come up through 90. And I'm just going to stay right here. I'm not touching the yoke, forward or aft. And eventually what's going to happen is the airplane is going to settle right back at that trimmed airspeed of 90 knots. This was what I was telling you before, is you trim for airspeed. So any changes that you make in the power is not going to change the airspeed, it's going to change your vertical speed. So here we are back again, round about 90 knots. Now let's pull the power back to 1700. And we'll see what happens then. Nose is going to pitch down. And because the nose is pitching down, your RPM will increase. So I'm going to pull that RPM back again to 1700. And now you can see the speed is dropping off. So the airplane is going to pitch down to increase that speed. And it's going to take a minute. But eventually, the airplane is going to find whatever vertical speed it needs to hold to maintain that 90 knots. You can see the oscillations are getting smaller and smaller. And now we're right back around at 90 knots. So you can see our speed hasn't changed whether we had the throttle at full throttle or 1600 RPM, 1650 RPM, or level flight for that matter, 2400. It stayed right there at that 90 knots. And that's what That's what we mean when we say trim for airspeed, not for vertical speed. So in order to slow an airplane down, just maintain level flight and pull some power out. If you want to speed an airplane up, let's do that. Let's go to 2400. Actually, no, 2100, excuse me. Let's go to 2100. See, we're back at our 90 knots. I haven't moved the yoke forward or backward at all. So now we're back at our 90 knots. Level flight. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to push some power in. Let's say we'll go to 2400, but this time I'm going to prevent the airplane from climbing. I'm going to push the nose down. 2500 is good. So we push the nose down, prevent the airplane from climbing, maintain level of flight, and the airspeed's going to increase. And then we can start putting in some nose down trim. Let some of the pressure off the yoke to see where we are. Put a little more nose down trim in. A little bit more. Go back to that 2500 that I had. And you can see now the airplane has sped up. Now if we want to slow the airplane down, pull the power back to 2100. Keep that nose from dropping. Now our airspeed's going to drop. So this may seem really simple, but this is how you control airspeed. And being able to control airspeed is really, really important. So now let's get back up to 3,000 feet, and we will head on over to our destination, and we'll talk about the role that trim plays in approach and landing. So climb power in an airplane like this is generally full power. So put in full power, climb back up to 3,000 feet. .50 feet below our cruise altitude. Let the nose drop a little bit. And start pulling the power out. And we'll level off at 3,000 feet. 2,400 RPM. I'm going to use some trim because we're trimmed for much higher airspeed. So again, 2,400. Push that nose down just a little bit. What I'm doing is watching the vertical speed. That's the deviation I'm looking for. I see the plane climbing a little bit, just pushing the yoke just a little bit and hold it there, and then add a little bit of trim, and then let the pressure off to see whether it stays there. One more push in, one click of nose down trim. Should be pretty good. Now, the difference in a real airplane and trimming in a real airplane versus trimming in the sim, in a real airplane you're trimming by feel. And all you're doing is feeling the kind of the opposite pressure that the yoke is giving you, and you're trimming out that pressure. So if I'm having to hold the yoke forward to maintain level flight, then I'm just going to put in some nose down trim, a little bit of nose down trim, and you can physically feel the pressure, the forward pressure that you have to hold on the yoke disappear. You can't do that in the sim, so really what you have to do is look at your vertical speed to see what the pressure is. And I hold it forward a little bit and give a click, hold it forward a bit, give a click, and then let go and see what it does. So it's a lot easier to trim in a real airplane than it is in the sim. Alright, let's see, we're getting over to towards our destination. We're about 10 miles out. There's the runway right there. So to begin a descent in the airplane, let's take a quick look outside. To begin a descent, all I'm going to do is pull out like 200 RPMs of power. So we're at 24. It's going to pull it out to 22. And then again, in order to maintain that 105 knots that we're trimmed for, the airplane's going to have to pitch the nose down. This is what's called trading altitude for airspeed. I'm going to bring it actually down back to about 2100. So what we're doing, we're exchanging altitude for airspeed. There's going to be a lot of mechanical turbulence right here. That is one of the most beautiful beaches you'll ever see, by the way, right there. I had a car stolen from me right there too, by the way. So in these types of planes, like in the Cessnas and the Cherokees, etc., I'll start my descent about 10 miles from the airport, and you can see this ring is 7.5 miles. So I started about 10 miles. And so what we're going to do, we'll get over in the traffic pattern, and I want to have my target airspeed, I want to be trimmed and level and trimmed for my target airspeed as we enter the traffic pattern. And that's going to make our work a lot easier. It's always better to get down sooner and then level off. I'll pull some more power than it is to wait and be late getting down and have to get down in a hurry. There's some wicked, it's the terrain right here. It's really some interesting terrain, very, very conducive to this type of turbulence. Right on the other side of this hill over here is where they filmed Death in Paradise, the BBC TV show. And so I'm looking about 1,000 feet AGL for our traffic pattern altitude. Descending right now about 500, which is good. Now, there's an expression that a good landing comes from a good approach, and there is no more true an expression in aviation. And so, like I was talking about, getting down sooner rather than later, leveling off, getting to your target airspeed, and having all that set up makes things a lot easier rather than trying to correct multiple things at the same time. Like if you're too high, too fast, trying to get down, trying to slow down, trying to get the airplane configured, not a winning combination. So here we are about 1600. I'm going to stay out here a little wide and we'll enter on a 45 to the downwind. There goes my pen. Alright. So, it's runway 12. So I want that 12 for a perfect downwind. I want that 12 down here. Again, we're too wide, which is fine. I'm gonna come, like I said, I'm gonna angle in left here. 45-degree entry to the downwind. And here we go for that. We're getting close to where we want to be in terms of altitude. So now, bring that power back to 1900. We're already below 110 knots. So I can put in that first notch of flaps. You can see now we're coming in to 1,000 feet. So what I'm going to do is start trimming a little nose up. Start trimming a little nose up to maintain this altitude. A little bit more power. I don't want my airspeed to get too low. And then I'll make a turn to the downwind here. Heading a 300. See, and now we're at the altitude we want to be at. I'm within the white arc on the airspeed indicator, so I can put in my next notch of flaps if I want to, when I want to. I'm just going to put in a little bit of power because I don't want to get too slow right now. Now we're going to aim to land on those 1,000-foot markers. So, we're at 1,000 feet in the white arc, and I'm hands off. I'm not touching anything, which is a great feeling. So right there, I want to pull out some power. Beam your touchdown point, pull out some power. I'll pull it back to about 1,700. Start a little descent here. Start a nice lazy descent. And once my touchdown point is about 45 degrees off my shoulder, looking back like this angle is about 45 degrees. Then I will put in my second notch of flaps. Now nose is going to want to pitch up, so I'll keep an eye on that. As that nose pitches up, your airspeed is going to drop. So I'm going to keep that nose down. So I'm going to pull some power out, and now I'm right at 70 knots, which is exactly where I want to be. Now in a high wing airplane it's a little bit more difficult because you can't see the runway on your left hand on your base turn. Little bit of nose down trim. I can tell I'm high, so I'm going to pull some power. Yeah, it's way high. So you can see that nose is wanting to pitch up.
500.
That nose is dying to pitch up, and you know why it's wanting to pitch up? Because I'm going faster than 70. Because it wants to be at 70. So we're going to ignore the fact that I've missed my touchdown point, and I'm just going to let the airplane settle at 70 knots like it wants to do. And we'll just let it come down right at 70 knots. And this is the next lesson about trim. Let's say right here I see a deer on the runway. Got to go around full power. Now what's going to happen? That airplane wants to hold 70 knots. So look what's happening. It's going to shoot straight up in the sky. So if you have to go around, be ready for that nose up movement. And the proper go around technique is to push that nose forward, get a positive rate of climb, walk up the first level of flaps, that second notch of flaps, get rid of it, watch that positive rate of climb again, get rid of that second notch of flaps. Now we're clean, we're climbing, and we're happy people. So we're going to try this landing once again. So that's the important thing to remember about trim on landing, is you're very often going to have, when you're landing, you're very often going to have nose up trim. So 50 feet below our desired altitude, which is 1,000 feet. I'm going to pull the power back. I'm going to pull it back to about 2,000. I'm making my left-hand turn. I'm going to be very happy at 90 knots if I can keep that. And I'm going to trim. Okay. It's a good downwind. I want to put in that first notch of flaps again already. That's going to push the nose up. I'm going to keep that nose down. I'm looking for this 3-0, which puts me on the downwind. Trim, trim, trim. So, again, 1900 RPM, 1,000 feet, 80 knots. Now, another really good thing, for planes that you fly regularly, know what your flap settings and power settings give you in terms of vertical speed and airspeed. You want to, like for this airplane, I want to know what power setting, what RPM setting I need for each flap setting to stay below 85 knots, let's say for 80 knots. So I know if I go to, let's say, 1850, one notch of flaps, I'm going to get 80 knots hands off, right? And these things allow you, it's not always going to be exact, but it gives you the chance to just automate those settings. You know, 1850 RPM, 1 degree, one notch of flaps, I'm going to be level at 80 knots. Okay, now we're going to pull that power out again. That'll be my touchdown point. And like we know from before, 2100 RPM clean, no flaps, gives us 90 knots. And it's like, good things to know are like, what's going to give you a 90 knot airspeed with a 500 foot per minute descent rate. Like that's a good one to have in your knowledge base, so that you can just automatically go to these power settings and flap settings, and you're going to get an expected performance. So I'm going to go that next degree of flaps, and the nose is up, so my speed is bleeding off. I don't want that. Happy with 70 knots. Happy with 70 knots. Alright. A little slower than 70 knots right now, but the nose is going to come down, and I know that's going to come down, so I'm not worried about it. Approach speed in this airplane is anywhere between 60 and 70 knots, so 65 is fine.
500.
Another good tip, always turn in your base to final turn too early rather than too late. Because if you turn in too late, you have to do this and overbank the airplane. And if you're using the rudder to try to get your nose around, you can cross coordinate and stall, and that's a bad place to be. So here we are, 65 knots. This is much better. And then if you're descending too quickly, just bring in a little bit of power. And it will just drop the power, pull that nose up. A little bit of rudder, and there we go. So that second one was a lot better than the first, but the first one gave me the opportunity to show you guys how to do a go-around. So the important thing to remember on approach and landing is that you want to be trimmed for your airspeed. You want to be trimmed for your target airspeed. And when you've got the airplane trimmed for a specific airspeed, say 65, 70 knots, whatever it is, or 80 if you're coming down, downwind. It just makes everything very, very easy to control. Just makes things easy to control when you're at a when you're in trim and everything's stable. So again, just remember, you trim for airspeed. Power is for vertical speed. Your airplane's always going to go back and find that trimmed airspeed, the airspeed that you're trimmed for. And if you add power, you will either cough is bad. If you add power, you are going to slow your rate of descent or climb. And if you reduce your power, you are going to slow your climb rate or descend, one of the two. And this is a really cool airport too, by the way. SLH Sim Designs, La Raisette, TFFR. Great airport. And one of the things, actually the last thing I'll tell you, if you're doing touch and goes, one of the things you have to remember to do is reset your trim. Brakes are set. Let's pull the mixture. Lights are off. Fuel pumps off. Avionics master switch off. So if you're doing touch and goes, people always remember to to check their flaps, make sure they get rid of the flaps if they need to, that sort of thing. But you also need to remember, because if you see that's our landing trim right there. It's nose up trim. And if you saw what happened when we went around. If you do just a normal takeoff, a touch and go takeoff, and you've got this nose up trim in, it can surprise you. So just if you're going around, or if you're doing touch and goes, always be aware of where your trim setting is, and be ahead of the game. Know what's going to happen. Know that nose is going to pitch up when you add power, and yeah, and leave your flaps up. Don't be like me and forget to put your flaps up. So that is it's a very simple video on how to use trim. But it's important, and people don't use trim enough. You should be flying. Everybody wants to use, autopilot in the sim. Everybody wants to use an autopilot. Uh, Poor man's autopilot, the trim. And I rarely ever used the autopilot in anything other than a transport category jet, because you just trim the airplane level and that's it. There's no trick to it. If you use the trim properly, that's how God made airplanes to fly. You use trim. Trim is your friend. So, if you guys have any comments, please let me know in the comments section. If you have any questions, any corrections, there may be corrections as well. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope it was useful for you, and hopefully this is something that people are interested in. And I'll make some more of these. Take care, and we'll see you next time.